Okay, so I went back and forth about what exactly to put up for you guys for this particular function. So this, if you missed class on Monday would have been the 26th. If you missed the 26th of October, we talked about, among other things, Skills 6. And for Skills 6, we did an in-class survey, which was a sort of a reverse version of what you did for your homework. And it's a tough thing to do in that same time period, although, I did see a lot of good stuff from what we did. Um, but I wanted to talk through kind of strong answers for that. I do feel like the conversation was productive in class. However, I understand that in the moment where you start studying for things, it's nice to have something you can grab. So if you're seeing this both the week of class and when you're going to start, what do you call it? Skills assessment B, which is skills 5 through 9, which includes 6, that's ideal, right? I think that you should watch it now being right after we just did skills 6 as kind of a review. Make sure you check yourself. And again, when you're going to go into that second skills assessment. So as you can see here, the subtitle is discussion of the in-class survey, but also the homework that you guys did for this section. I think I just want to talk through some of those answers too. Again, I'm seeing a lot of progress on this. I also wanted to say explicitly, the typical way that we learn to do this, and by this I mean to learn to write something kind of scholarly in sort of a scientific area, so-called scientific writing. The usual way that students learn to do this is by trial and error. And when I designed this way of learning how to write kind of scientific background stuff, it's not something that I pulled out of a book. These are the skills that when I got to graduate school, I didn't yet have. And I don't think they're taught either explicitly, or if they're taught explicitly, they're not taught explicitly in undergrad level. And maybe I'm wrong, which would be great, but I doubt that. Okay, so to that end, it's difficult to find written sources that are completely consistent with what we're doing. I am on the hunt for things you could read on the side if you're interested. Regardless, I'm seeing a lot of progress, but let's talk through, again, the survey and the homework. All right, if you missed this week's class or would like a refresher, this is the little piece out of an article that we read. This is the first half. There's 2 more paragraphs on the next page. I'll read it out loud just for the sake of argument. Okay, so the article was Woo 2020, just came out actually. L1 transfer and L2 acquisition of their insertion construction by Mandarin EFL learners. However, what we're reading here is not specifically about Mandarin, because this is stuff about transfer, okay? There was a previous section about their insertion constructions in English and the closest thing that exists in Mandarin, because that's what the study is on, and then this piece on transfer goes with it. So here it says, in the past 2 decades, a great number of studies focused on the L2 acquisition, the lexicon, and argument structure. According to Jeffs 2000, L2 acquisition of the verb meaning and its argument structure, as well as syntactic behaviors, causes an interesting learnability problem. Learnability problem usually refers to things that are challenging to acquire in a second language, right? On one hand, L2 learners have to find out how verbs are classified into semantically coherent classes with the positive clues in the L2 input. On the other hand, they also need to figure out that some verb classes sharing that same semantic characteristics across languages behave similarly in syntactic manifestations, while some other verb classes sharing the same semantic properties across linguistics exhibit totally different syntactic behaviors. The short version of this is that when we're learning in L2, we have to figure out what's similar and what's not similar. Specifically here about verb behavior by the class. That's a transfer problem, okay? So if you think it's going to act like your L1, you transfer your L1, you're either right or you're wrong. So one type of alternation occurs between change of state verbs, so-called COS in this article, and manner of motion verbs, MOM. In English, COS verbs are those that indicate coming into existence, such as come, happen, and arrive. If you were to have read the whole article, these are the ones you can say, there happened to be something. There arrived a man. It's talking about their insertion construction. You'd have to read the whole article, but anyway. And MOM verbs are agentive, like run and walk, okay? So if you're interested, they like to refer to these come, happen, and arrive verbs as sort of deep subject verbs. They're the ones that in like Italian and French take an alternate auxiliary. So whereas in French you would say, if you want to say he's arrived, like he has arrived, in French you say he is arrived, right? Whereas run and walk is he has run, he has walked. So this distinction, depending on your language, has certain behaviors. In English, we see some funny stuff with the first category. It just so happens that Mandarin has some of these alternations depending on, I think you have more options of word order, I think with the MOMs, but I'd have to go back and look at the article. Anyway, so 2 verb categories, they do different stuff syntactically depending on language, although they have kind of broad semantic groupings. The categorization and syntactic behavior of verbs differ cross-linguistically with respect to COS-MOM division. By testing the role of L1 influence on L2 acquisition, L1 influence is code here for transfer. So of agentive verbs of MOM and COS, here's more examples. March and walk are agentive. Break and melt are kind of these deep subject verbs. It happens to me kind of stuff. They also get called unaccusative sometimes. In Spanish and English, Montreuil suggests that L2 learners assume the lexicosyntactic representations of verb classes on the basis of their L1. They transfer. Seriously, that's the extent of it. Here we talk about Montreuil's study. Montreuil designed 2 experiments respectively on L2 English and L2 Spanish in order to investigate the L1 effects. Learners whose L1 is English took part in the Spanish study. So L1 English, L2 Spanish. Whereas a learner whose L1 was Spanish participated in the English study. Okay. In her experiment, she recruited a separate group of Turkish learners in these 2 studies. For verbs of MOM in Turkish behave similarly in Spanish. Okay, so the idea would be because Turkish and Spanish are similar, if they transfer their L1 Turkish onto their Spanish, they should be correct. If they transfer their L1 Turkish onto L2 English, they should be incorrect. This is the idea. Let's see. The experimental results indicate that L2 English study Spanish and Turkish learners made undergeneralization errors, and they incorrectly rejected verbs of MOM while correctly accepting COS verbs. So they're not completely accurate, and Spanish and Turkish behave the same. In the L2 Spanish study, this other way, English speakers made overgeneralization errors, accepting both verbs of MOM and COS, whereas the Turkish speakers behaved differently from English speakers, neither overgeneralizing nor undergeneralizing, because they're like Spanish in their L1, right? So transfer helped out the Turkish speakers for Spanish and did not for English. And in fact, the important group in this study isn't the English or the Spanish themselves, it's the Turkish learners. Anyway, the last sentence here says, the results confirm that L1 restricts the L2 acquisition of argument structure to a certain extent. So the last paragraph. In the field of second language acquisition, there are debates over whether L2 learners could recover from L1 transfer, especially L1-induced overgeneralization errors, because that was, yeah, I think that was the English problem in this case, right? They overgeneralized, which means they thought something should be good that wasn't. That's all that means. Undergeneralization means they didn't think it would be good, but it was. That's all it means. The full transfer, full access, this is a full transfer, right? Hypothesis. It predicts that the transfer stage will eventually be overcome by L2 learners. They usually resort to UG to restructure their interlanguage grammar. Okay, so they're saying full transfer would, of course, cause transfer problems. But this full access thing says that UG can fix it. Now remember, the fundamental difference hypothesis says no access to UG, which is why it appears next to that, right? Fundamental difference hypothesis, on the contrary, claims that L2 learners could only resort to their L1 and L2 acquisitions. They don't have access. So they're like a non-access to UG position, right? That is the fundamental difference between L1 and L2 in that particular theory. And the novel and subtle knowledge of the syntax semantics interface is not possible. Thus, overgeneralization errors are difficult to overcome in the end-state grammar. Okay? All right. So before we look at some of your answers, which you'll see some of them agree, what do I see here? I see a study about transfer, and I see this issue about over and under generalization. Okay, so within this subsection, those are kind of the biggest pieces, but especially transfer. This is a section about transfer, okay? Because remember, when we zoom out, we need a section on each construct, and the first one was like verb categories, which is the piece you didn't see. And then this is on transfer, okay? And in here, we see some discussion of the other construct, right? Oh, what happens with the verb categories and stuff, but it's about transfer. To my eyes, this article, like I said, they're saying here, they're talking about what's the role of transfer in semantic properties and verb categories. They describe an example. They talk about how transfer mucked up the behavior of Turkish and English and Spanish learners when learning these particular things. And then they would say, well, the question is really, do they acquire it later, right? So they're saying, okay, so we're predicting that if you have access to UG, you'll eventually fix that transfer stuff. And if you don't, you won't, right? So that is what this section's about, okay? Transfer, it seems to happen. Here's some evidence that it happens, differs cross-linguistically. Can we access UG and overcome it? This is what I see when I look at this sample, okay? So I asked you guys what the constructs or construct or constructs is focused the subsection, and I would have accepted transfer. Of the answers I got in this section, these were some of the best ones I saw. So frequency of errors such as overgeneralization, effects of L1 transfer on L2 acquisition of agreement verbs. So that answer was fine. So transfer and frequency, cool. And then the second one says transfer again, generalization, frequency, and verb classes, cool. But not everybody mentioned transfer. It's in the title. Guys, when we outline or put titles, they usually are telling us what it's about. Try not to ignore that. I'm seeing a lot of ignoring that. Same thing happened on the homework, actually, which we'll get to in a second. Don't ignore that. They're trying to help you. All right, so I'm including two. So I asked you to outline that section. So I just kind of talked through mine. I asked you guys to do that. I'm including two examples from different either individual students or groups. I no longer remember who wrote what. So if yours is in here, kudos. These were two I thought were pretty good, right? So this person said, all right, so, and this is the sample outline that I pulled out of the homework, actually. Let's see. Change of state verbs and manner of motion verbs are an example of verbs that cause issue cross-linguistically because their categorization can behave differently. Okay, so languages differ. L1 can affect the overgeneralization or undergeneralization in L2. So transfer can cause you to overgeneralize or undergeneralize. And that these two theories, so full transfer, full access claims you'll be able to overcome it because of UG. And FDH argues you won't because you don't have UG. Okay, I thought that was totally fine. Right? This gets to the meat of what that was about. And some of you guys were, and this happened in the homework too, really zooming in and trying to tell me in the outline piece or the explanation of the outline, you know, too much detail, you know, because if you don't totally understand it, I think you just kind of copy down stuff. And if we do really understand it, we're able to summarize it. And part of that's practice. Part of that's practice. But part of that is just reading a little closer. We need to not lose track of what construct are we talking about, because I think we kind of, because if you don't know what construct you're focusing on, you kind of can give unnecessary importance to things that are tangential to the point. Okay, so if you picked the wrong construct, it's kind of a problem in that sense, right? Once again, the titles are often helpful. Let's just put it that way, okay? Another example that I thought was good. So this group or person says, L2 learners need to be able to semantically classify verbs which may behave differently in an L2 than L1. Two specific types are the COS and the MOM, which are often different syntactically, semantically. Cool. It's predicted L2 learners will assume these things, so they're going to transfer. Once again, the person who wrote this article didn't use the word transfer that much, although it was in the title, right? But this is all transfer. They're going to assume these things. They're going to transfer them. And then this person, as opposed to the previous example, their last bullet point was about access, non-access to UG. This person kind of looked at the Montreal results as their third bullet point, which I'm okay with, actually. Spanish and Turkish L2 learners of English incorrectly reject MOM verbs, whereas an L2 Spanish English learners overgeneralize. So it supports that L1 is restricting L2 acquisition. I think this also works, right? Because the take-home point of this section could either have been about the theories or it could have been about transfer, because this section about transfer, right? And in essence, the last paragraph, the thing about the two theories is sort of what are we testing and why? It's almost beyond the bigger, the question in the section is what is transfer doing with its lexical classes, right? So this is actually, for me, this is totally fine too, because the person is saying that transfer is happening, and thus far we're not seeing them overcoming it for these two categories of verbs because the article is about these categories of verbs. Okay, yeah? All right. I had two optional questions, which were how does this article relate to the critical period hypothesis? How does it relate to the initial state? I didn't get a lot of answers, which is fine, because as I told you, those things were kind of, if you finished, I'd love to know your answers, right? It's kind of thinking broader and bigger, and if you didn't, it doesn't bother me. But these were the three I got for this first question. So how does the article relate to the critical period hypothesis? Well, not specifically talking about age. The article weighs whether L1 cuts off acquisition of language-specific features. So does it have UG? Here being representations of verb classes by way of the speaker taking only their L1 representation, as FDH would say, or whether they can take to UG to restructure the grammar. They have access to UG, as FDFA would say, right? So this person is pointing out that the theories at the end are talking indirectly about the critical period hypothesis, as to say that, one of those theories said you had UG after the critical period and the other one didn't. So I agree, absolutely. The second person, who I think wrote, after both of their answers for this and the next question, says this article relates because it is discussing the L2 acquisition of verbs, which is difficult due to cross-linguistic diversity, which is similar to critical period because if it was learned within the critical period, it wouldn't be a learnability issue. Yep, yeah, absolutely, right? So if you think there's a critical period, if you think that we're, or rather, even if we're debating it, right? If we don't know if we have UG or we don't, or we think we do, we think we don't, if we're pre-critical period, it's a moot point because it's not L2 really, right? Yes, so I agree. In that way, it also relates. And this last person said, this research to support the critical period hypothesis, assuming they're adults, by claiming that transferring in some sense is hindering native likeness. I agree. That's also true, right? So you could say it relates to critical period hypothesis because transfer is something needs to become overcome, right? So if you think that that is impossible to overcome for some reason, that could, for example, could be evidence of a critical period. Or, and again, this issue of being able to access UG is another thing, right? Right, it's another big piece of the question. But I think this person's on the right track, right? That, if L1 is truly hindering, if it's truly, truly hindering, we can't overcome it, then yeah, that might be a critical period thing. Yeah. Relatedly, how does this article relate to the initial state? I got two answers. The I think person is here still. If learners lean on their L1 representations of verb classes in L2, then that would either uphold initial state full transfer or partial transfer position, right? So this person's saying if they're transferring, it's not no transfer. Yep, definitely. And the second person is kind of talking about whether you have access to universals or not, for example. This person says this relates to initial state because it's discussing the ability to acquire something or not depending on what tools you already have, right? So for example, if you have UG, right, at the initial state, which again is what those two theories were debating, it would have totally different predictions about whether you could reset your parameters, whether you could acquire things that are not available in your first language. So I agree wholeheartedly. All right. Okay. Briefly on the homework. For the first question, once again, I asked you, what are the constructs? And the second section was basically called verbal aptitude. That should really, truly be a clue. And about a third of you didn't include verbal aptitude as one of the constructs. Okay, so that's a big deal. And when I told you what the hypothesis was in the third question, verbal aptitude was in there. It is a construct, okay? If I'm asking questions about it, if I'm dedicating sections to it, if the hypothesis includes it, it's a construct. That is the purpose of a construct. It's what we're testing, okay? And, some of you, okay, and yeah, all right, okay, so that's what this says here. Okay, cool. And then the second question, so I asked you, what question is this person, De Kaiser it was, studying in this particular outline? And so since the two constructs were basically age of acquisition and aptitude, or verbal aptitude is a particular version thereof, those things should have been in the question. Remember we talked about this when we had, or maybe you didn't watch my videos, you should be, because it's equivalent to class. Yes, the videos are class, even though we're not face-to-face, my friends. But anyway, the ideal answer number 2 is something like, what's the relationship between age of acquisition and verbal aptitude? Or I accepted versions of critical period as well, but the questions that you ask, what question are they attempting to answer, should feature your constructs prominently. I accepted some that were more wordy than this, talked indirectly. Some kind of got almost because they didn't actually ask a question. Or you basically, if you skipped verbal aptitude, once again, you got half credit because there's a whole section. It's called role of verbal aptitude, okay? If we're looking at its role, it's a construct, okay? Some of you did get this. So to those of you who did or almost did, kudos, all right? But this is definitely something that at this point you should be picking up, okay? Worst case scenario, what you do is you open up the homework, you copy down the questions, you can use screen print or whatever you need to do, and you look at the blank thing and you do it again, and then compare it to this presentation, okay? You should do this multiple times until you get it right, okay? Even if you're working on the same one several times, think it through, practice it, right? Take it out blank and do it again. You know, this is something, it's a skill, you have to practice it. You think it through, do it a few times. And finally, the last question, I actually gave everybody points for this question. Not everybody earned that full, it was worth a point, the last question. Not everybody earned that point equally, honestly, but I realized as I was reading it, and it's part of the reason that this homework features in this particular presentation because it relates, that I would be giving a lot of very detailed feedback if I were going to approach it that way by writing on every single person who needed feedback's thing. And yeah, in my experience, not everyone reads that feedback, so I'm addressing it here. So the last question was, what is the relevance of the final bullet point under role of verbal aptitude? And it states, it remains an imperial question how important a role of analytic ability plays in an L2 learning by adults whose skills develop over a long period of constant exposure to the L2, and what the consequences are for those adults who lack high verbal ability, educational experience, language analysis, or both. Okay. So the relevance of this bullet point is it's the motivation for the hypothesis. And a few of you did talk in terms of the constructs because that is what guides our understanding. Constructs, 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 please, constructs. We can do it, okay? So the relevance of this last bullet point is the motivation for the hypothesis, right? It tells us what's known about the relationship between these constructs, and it sort of goes, and it's an imperial question, as in we don't know yet. Ergo, we make a hypothesis based upon that question, okay? Some of you got this, cool. But if you didn't, if you're looking at this going, it's not what I wrote, I want you to go back in, copy out the questions, including the sample, use print screen if you must, and if you don't know how to print screen, Google it. Do it again, all right? You need to figure out how to do this. If you do it again and want my feedback on that version, I am very happy to give it. But we need to practice, okay? All right, questions on this, let me know, and I will see you in